Thank you to everyone who is joining us this afternoon. This is obviously an important topic to so many people, and we are grateful for everyone's interest. I'm Kathy Collett. I'm an ALS advocate from Indianapolis, Indiana. We lost Mom to ALS almost 25 years ago. I would especially like to thank I AM ALS for hosting this event today. I AM ALS is a community-led organization composed of people living with ALS and their loved ones. They provide critical support and resources to those with ALS caregivers and families. Their special sauce is to empower advocates to raise awareness and lead the revolution against ALS in driving the development for treatments and cures. This meeting came to be as a result of a conversation that Sandy Morris, and for those of you who might not know Sandy Morris, she is a living force, a woman with ALS who is awesome. So Sandy and Alison Bateman-House and I had a call regarding expanded access, and we're talking about why in the world these programs didn't seem to happen in ALS the way they do in oncology and other areas. As we were discussing the barriers, Alison made a very generous offer to host a forum for industry. This would be more efficient than a lot of one-on-one conversations and certainly would help elevate the conversations and sort some facts from myths. So Sandy and I went to I AM ALS, and they have been wonderful about taking care of all the details to make this day happen. So thank you all very much. Many special thanks to Michael Lecker of I AM ALS, to Sandy, to Lisa from Everything ALS, who's been helping us, and to Gwen, who couldn't be here today, who all contributed to putting this together. Before we start, please know that we have a lot of pre-submitted questions to try to cover after the presentation. In addition, you may type questions into the Q&A. And I ask, if you're a member of industry, to take a moment and rename yourself to something that includes the word industry, so that we'll see that in your question and we'll be able to make sure that you get to the top of the question queue. Finally, Sandy Morris was to be the person to introduce Dr. Bateman-House today. Unfortunately, the ALS isn't cooperating, so Sandy asked me to fill in. Dr. Bateman-House is an ethicist, a public health professional, and a medical historian. Her research is primarily focused on ethics and policy issues concerning access to investigational medical products, both inside and outside of clinical trials. One particular area of interest is the equity of access. Who gets access to what and how? You talk about timely topics. Alison has them. I first met her in 2017 at the ALS MND Symposium in Boston, where she was a panelist. We tweeted back and forth, go figure that. Since then, I've learned a lot from Alison about access to experimental therapies. And I think she's learned from me and from Sandy and from Gwen and others a lot about ALS. Whether you agree or not, you can always be assured of an honest, informative discourse from Alison. We are so grateful for her generosity with her time today. We are so pleased at having this information presented for industry and for the benefit of everybody with ALS. So thank you, Alison. The Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you, Kathy, for that generous introduction. And I just want to join my thanks in thanking, Kathy and Sandy for really conceptualizing this with me, and then Michael, Lisa, and Gwen for really being the powerhouse pushing it forward. So I'm going to go, unfortunately, at lightning speed, just because I have so much information I want to share. And I ask Kathy to please cut me off so that we have time for Q&A. So I'm just going to go as fast as I can to cover as much as I can before Kathy yanks the Zoom floor back out from underneath me. Let me just get rid of this. Okay. So here's who I am. I'm Alison Bateman-House. You already heard. I'm a medical ethicist. One thing that you did not hear is that I co-chair a academic working group that actually works on compassionate use and pre-approval access. So this is my basically full-time area of expertise. I have a list here of entities in the ALS space that I have provided consultation or advice to, along with whether there was any sort of financial transaction. So please feel free to peruse that as I'm making my introductory comments. And I think my main introductory comment is that I'm speaking on behalf of myself. And as Kathy said, you may or may not agree with me on everything, but I'm going to do my best to give you, both an honest assessment of the facts and then where I have opinions to share my opinions. And you'll see throughout this in blue text, things that I really want to highlight are my opinion, not necessarily a statement of fact. And these are, again, on me as an individual, not on behalf of any of the organizations on this slide, nor on behalf of my employer, the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, nor on behalf of that working group that I co-chair, which has a formal process for making statements, and I don't speak on behalf of it. So with that, again, the background was that when Sandy and Kathy and I talked about this, they really asked that I speak to an industry audience knowledgeable about expanded access. And they were very firm. They did not want me to do an expanded access 101 session. So for any of you who need that or want that, I want to point you real quick to our webpage for the working group that I co-chair. Just search online for NYU CUPA, C-U-P-A, and you'll find this page. I have a screenshot here, and you can see in the sort of column that starts with a purple bar at the top, there's a red circle around frequently asked questions. So we have a frequently asked questions that may be helpful. We also do a free expanded access 101 webinar annually. We've already done it for this year, unfortunately, but we will do it again next year. And to get announcements of that and other things that the group does, you can just email the name that you see here, Sage Gustafson, nyulangone.org, who is the project manager for that program. Also, I want to draw your attention to a recent webinar put on by Niels. This was Trials of the Future on April 30th of this year. You can see the speakers at the bottom of the page. I learned a lot. I think the other speakers, to really just experienced clinicians in the ALS field, clinician researchers in the ALS field, they say they learned a lot too. I think it was a very frank and very sort of reflective webinar, and I highly recommend checking it out if you have the opportunity. So with that, I'm going to get to the core of what it is I'm here to talk about, which is expanded access in the ALS space. And before I get into the details, I want to just set up some background context. And I think at some point, I'm probably going to say something to annoy every person in the audience, regardless of your background. And so I'm going to start off by annoying the drug development and industry colleagues who are on this call, simply by reminding us all that drug development is largely conducted by for-profit entities. And there are some people who find this, just a disgusting state of affairs. There are other people who say, look, this has been a very successful modality. Like, we have a lot of drugs, we have a lot of disease modifying treatments that we did not have prior to this. And, this is working. I think the truth is probably somewhere in between there. And I'm not here to pass judgment on that. This is just a fact, is that drug development is largely conducted by for-profit entities. And that means that at the same time that I have discussions with companies about expanded access, or patient advocacy groups have discussions with companies about expanded access, and people within companies are making good faith plans, there's always this, sort of looming specter in the background that is, the goal of this company, the goal of this entity is to bring a new product to market at a price that's going to reward the developer. And that's just what there is. So you have to really make a business case for what it is you're asking a company to do. I just want to note that in this conversation, I'm talking about unapproved drugs, investigational drugs, experimental drugs, but just think about what you all know for a moment about access to approved drugs, FDA approved drugs. Access is unequal. You can get access to things depending on what your insurance is, if you can pay out of pocket, et cetera. So we're already building on an inequitable system, and then trying to look at this one little area of it, which is access to investigational medicines. And people like me are trying to say, what can we do to make this equitable? And it's just, frankly, it's never going to work perfectly, because we're building it on top of an inequitable system. And that's just facts. I don't like it, but we would have to have a really like societal revolution for that not to be the case. And so when the development decisions are being made, it's really in this context of, we have to have, an eye on the financial realities of what's happening. And we really need all decisions to be made with an eye on generating compelling data for this regulatory submission, because that's our goal. We are a for-profit business trying to do this. Now, I have here a question, which if someone on the call from industry wants to answer it, I would love to know the answer, because for the 7 years or so that I've worked in this area, the one thing that is very confusing to me when I say, everything's being done with this business mindset and with an eye on trying to get, FDA or other regulator compelling data. The thing that very much confuses me is there is often a lack of ongoing clear communication with those regulators during development. So I can't tell you how many companies I've worked with, not in the ALS space necessarily, in all therapeutic areas, who are sort of working in a void of, well, we think FDA is going to act like this, but we're not really sure, and maybe EMA is going to do this, and we haven't really discussed it with them, but based on what's happened with a competitor, this is what we anticipate. To me, as a non-business person, that seems to up the risk and up the chance of doing something that in retrospect, you're going to say, wow, I wish we had not done that. We just wasted time and patient effort and everything else. So that is a concern that I'm just going to put out there. One thing that I have here in blue, I said in blue was sort of my opinions. So when I'm speaking to people in industry, I want to just urge you up front to be transparent with the advocacy community, with clinicians, with everyone about your financial constraints. You are working to try to bring transformational drugs to market. That's expensive. And not all of you have the same amount of money with which to work. Maybe you're a privately owned corporation. Maybe, you have shareholders. Maybe it's a philanthropy funded endeavor. You're going to have different amount of money available, and that's really going to impact what you can do, both in the clinical trial space and in the non-trial space that I'm really talking about here. I think you should just be honest with people about that. And also keep in mind that, the expenses involved in doing something that's a pill versus, say, an intrathecal injection every 3 weeks. These are incredibly different things. So just trying to help people understand what is the business reality that you are operating in, so that people can work together and brainstorm the best strategies to go forward. I just want to point out, when we start talking about ALS in particular, in general, in the biopharmaceutical arena, there's less investment in indications that are seen as high risk. And let's just be frank, ALS is seen as high risk because there have not been very many successful therapies to date brought to market. So that means that there's less companies in this space, although there have been more in recent years, which is great. And those companies potentially have less investors who are interested in funding them. So that just really means that you're working at a disadvantage to, say, oncology, where there's a lot of money because the investment risk is seen as lower, simply because historically there have been successes. This doesn't mean that things won't change. I think as soon as you have one breakthrough therapy or things that really start looking promising, things may well change. I'm just sort of trying to paint the picture that we're dealing with right now. And I also want to note that, when you're dealing with these market realities, it means that there's an incentive to concentrate on more common indications. And so, ALS is a rare disease. It's certainly not the rarest disease out there, but also we think that ALS can probably be divided into subpopulations. So when you start getting to smaller groups, it may be easier to, come up with a targeted therapy because you have a better idea of, in this small group, this is the gene that's involved, or this is the pathway, et cetera. But you're also sort of taking away the idea of a widespread commercial population. So those two things kind of war against each other in terms of interesting a company in addressing your specific indication. And I said that this might irritate people in industry for me to be laying all this out there. I am not trying to cast blame or to say anybody in industry is bad. I actually feel sad frequently talking with people in industry because I experience that they are experiencing lots of moral distress. They go, we went into this because we want to help people. We went into this because we're really, excited about what science can do to improve the lives of patients and their families. And then having to make decisions that may potentially mean saying no to somebody or closing down a trial. It's painful for people. So I don't think it does me any good to finger point and say things, things are bad or people are bad. I think it's just important to understand this is a complicated ecosystem where there's lots of background motivators, and not all of those background motivators are necessarily trying to help people. There's also financial, there's also, other. So I guess that's all I wanted to say with that background. And then talking about ALS specifically. So I mentioned a minute ago that ALS, we have a category that we think is ALS, but it could be that it needs to be broken up. Maybe there are different types of ALS. So there's really this heterogeneity of patient experiences. And that, I think, on one level, patients and caregivers understand, but I'm not sure they necessarily, and of course, when you talk about patients, there is no like one patient. There are patients who are like highly sophisticated and understand more of this stuff than I do. And then there's others who are like not sophisticated. So when I talk about what patients understand, I understand that I'm making a generalization here that is not true in all cases. But I'm not sure that at least all patients understand these following points that really pin directly to that idea of the fact that ALS is heterogeneous and different in different people. Number one, sometimes you have atypical responders in trials. This is common. It's not just in ALS, it's in all therapeutic areas. You can have what's considered a failed trial, and still some percentage of people who were in the trial seem to have improved. And just keeping in mind that business proposition that I'm talking about, that drug may not be seen as actionable by a drug developer. They can say, okay, well, X% of people seem to improve, but that's not statistically significant. That's not going to be compelling to regulators. It's not going to be compelling to payers. We're not moving forward with that. And I think that's something that really needs to be explained to people, because when they themselves had a good experience, or they've heard anecdotally of one or two good experiences, it's obviously, the response that you go, wow, this is an effective treatment. And then when development on it stops, people obviously don't understand and or are angered. So keep in mind that not all responses in trials are true treatment effects. Some of them are placebo effects. Some of them, you change your diet or something at the same time. There are all sorts of things going in the background, which is why we do trials the way we do, is to try to, really have a bunch of different controls on the people involved in the trials and their experiences, and try to winnow down those outside influences, but you can never get totally rid of them. So it's just important to remember that yes, some percentage of patients in the trials may have improved or had a slowing of progression. Doesn't necessarily mean it was related to the therapeutic compound being tested in the trial. And just to make this even more frustrating, you could have a trial that's positive, but if you go back and do the same trial all over again, just in a different set of patients, even with the same inclusion criteria, you could come up with a different outcome, simply because that's what happens when we repeat trials, is sometimes we get different things. Something that was, minor, significant, but not, super significant, just sort of marginally significant. The next time around isn't significant at all, or, it is much more significant. And it's just one of the frustrations of doing drug development, is that, you're looking at a subset of a large patient population, and the answers that you get from that trial will depend. And this raises a question for my industry colleagues on the call about those compounds that drug development says, this is not actionable enough, we're not taking them forward. What happens to those shelved compounds? And then I think that's something that I would encourage you to speak with patient advocacy about, because perhaps they would be willing or able to help you find other people to try to push research on those compounds forward. Maybe it's just that, the sample wasn't right. Maybe it was that the endpoint of the trial wasn't right. Maybe either, the sponsor that did the trial initially or some other sponsor can come back and be able to get some success with a compound that otherwise, is just not going to be used because there was an initial trial that did not show, the desired outcome. Keep in mind, please, I beg of you, that not all trials have interpretable findings. And so it may be that at the end of your randomized control trial, you're going to have to do another randomized control trial. I frequently find patients don't understand that. They have a timeline in their mind. The trial is going to end in, January. And that means after that is when there'll be an open label extension, or there'll be an expanded access program, or there'll be some other type of post-trial access. That's all provisional based on us being able to interpret the trial. If we interpret the trial and the outcome's negative, there's probably not going to be any post-trial access of any type. If we end the trial and the results are uninterpretable, there's probably not going to be those post-trial access programs in the way that we were previously perceiving of, because there's going to have to be another RCT. So that's really important to appropriately set patient expectations about, you've gotten through the trial, or, you weren't eligible for the trial, but you've been watching the trial progress, and here's what's going to happen next. I think people need to understand that these are all contingencies. Investigator-initiated trials. This is when a physician or a researcher says to a sponsor, hey, you're developing drug X for Y. I think drug X may work in R. You're not interested, apparently, in running a trial on your drug X in R, but why don't you let me have it? I'll enroll, 10 patients with R, test it, get some data. What do you say? On one hand, investigator-initiated trials are great for getting just some sort of preliminary thoughts about what does this drug do in a different indication. On the other hand, it's really, really, really important for patients and that investigator to understand what is or is not being promised by the drug company. So if the drug company shelves that compound for the indication they were working on, does that mean that the investigator-initiated trial for this other indication also ends? Will the drug continue to be provided? Is there some level of data that investigator can hand the company that would make the company, reevaluate their decision, et cetera? So just really important to be clear upfront when you set up an investigator-initiated trial about what, sort of obligations you are accepting to take on, and how far into the future those obligations extend and through what circumstances. I put here in blue, because again, this is me recommending something, a requirement for clinical trial data transparency. This isn't 100% a recommendation. There is actually, legality behind this, but we're in a phase right now where they're increasing requirements for clinical trial data transparency. Just to speak as a straight ethicist for a moment, I would say the sort of grand bargain in human subjects research is that we are going to experiment on somebody. And the reason that that is justifiable, to the extent that it is justifiable, we'll talk about that later, because obviously not all research is justifiable, but to the extent that it's justifiable, it is justifiable because we're learning something from it. And the only way to learn something from it is actually to be able to put out that data. We're not saying, just this investigator or just this company is learning something. We're saying that we as a society are learning from this experience. And that means you really have to share the data with other people, at very least to keep people from, reinventing the wheel and doing something that was already, pretty much proven not to work over and over again. I put here dangerous trend of trying to weaponize patient voice. I see this in lots of therapeutic areas. There are a few companies, and I'm not going to name any names, who really seem to have this idea that it's okay to have weak or even uninterpretable trial findings, because as long as they have an activist patient group pressing for it, that will be sufficient to get regulatory approval. I don't think that's a trend that we want to continue, and I'm happy to talk about that during Q&A if you're interested. And then the last thing on my background, and then we're going to get right into the meat of expanded access, is just a reminder about wherever there is an unmet need, and God knows ALS is an unmet need of, just devastating proportions, there are going to be non-legitimate actors who seek to monetize patient desire for treatments. And I would urge all of us, industry, patient advocacy, clinicians, et cetera, to say, on one hand, when you see bad actors, it's good to name them, but probably more importantly, we really have a acute need to educate the community about how to identify bad actors for themselves. So just to give you an example, generally speaking, and again, I'm not pointing at any actor in the ALS space, when I see a quote unquote pay to play trial in which a patient, the participant in the trial, pays X amount of money up front as an entree into the trial, that raises questions for me. The questions that it raises for me is this science not compelling enough that no other funder is willing to pay the trial cost? And does this company really, or sponsor really have what it takes to be able to see a trial through to regulatory approval and then bring the product to market if it works? And it could be that there's a quote pay to play trial that meets both of those criteria, but that's the red flag that goes up for me immediately when I see a trial like this. So I think there are just certain things that, in terms of health literacy and sort of, caveat, what caveat emptor? I failed Latin. I don't have any idea. Buyer beware. I just think there's certain things that the community could do to help out, simply because we know that where there's an unmet need, there will be people who try to take advantage of people in that space. So on prioritization of clinical trials over non-trial access. So non-trial access, expanded access, right to try, compassionate use, whatever any of the terminologies you want to talk about, they are seen as secondary to clinical trials. Clinical trials are always prioritized. Why? In most of the world, this is the law. In most of the world, it says if you're eligible for a clinical trial, that's your only option. You don't get to do this non-trial option. And then, I'm an ethicist. So in ethics, we tend to look for things that lead to the greatest good for the greatest number. Well, trials are what bring products to market. So there's only a small number of people who are going to be able to get non-trial access to something. But if we complete the trial and the product is, demonstrated safe and effective, we will be able to bring it to market where more people will be able to get access to it. And again, it's not going to be perfect. I mentioned earlier inequity of access to approved products, but it's still going to be a larger number of people than those who can just sort of figure out how to maneuver through non-trial access, which is meant to be exceptional. So that's just a background. And when I talk with companies, or when I talk with patient advocacy groups or FDA or whoever I'm talking to, and they want to talk to me about expanded access or non-trial access, I always say, let's talk about your trial first, because your need for expanded access is going to depend on what your trial looks like. So we'll come back to that. I just want to note, different people find different types of evidence compelling. So some people, they can look at numeric tables and not really feel swayed one way or another, and then hear a story and find that very compelling evidence. I think we've seen this quite a bit in the COVID-19 vaccine space in terms of what people really find convincing about, demonstrating safety and efficacy of vaccines, et cetera. And I just want to remind you, this goes back to that first slide of, this is a business proposition whose eye is on bringing products to market. So in drug development, the evidence that sponsors and really everyone is looking for is evidence that's going to be compelling to regulators, clinicians, and payers, not patients. And you can say, what industry says, it's patient-centric. And yes, it does say that. And I think different companies to varying degrees are patient-centric, but it doesn't change the fact that when it's trying to think about what data do I need to collect, they're looking for data that's convincing to regulators, clinicians, and payers. And this is typically RCT, randomized controlled trial data. Not always. And, I think that this is changing over time, but I think we're still very much in a situation in which the expectation will be for a sponsor to have a robust RCT that shows demonstrated efficacy and safety for a drug to be able to move successfully into the marketplace. Now, I want to balance this by saying, that makes it sound like patients have no power. They're just sort of pawns at the whim of these other entities. But I want to point out that you cannot fully enroll trials, and you certainly can't fully enroll trials quickly unless potential participants, those patients, find them appealing and possible. So, I really urge industry to do things like, at very minimum reimbursement of trial-related expenses, at very minimum compensation for time and effort. I actually advocate paying people outright because, that you pay people for their labor. This is labor that participants are putting in to move trials forward. That's a fairly radical idea. So even if you don't pay your patients, your participants in the trial, you need to be at least compensating them for their time. You can make trials more or less arduous to participate, and I urge you to make them as less arduous as possible, particularly in ALS, where it's so difficult to take someone to a trial site. I'm really encouraged by this move towards, remote monitoring or virtual trials. I think that's great. And you can come up with a trial design that makes it easier for that participant, once they get in the trial, to try a variety of agents, and that's something like the platform trials. So I don't think that patients and potential trial participants are, pawns who have no power in this. I think they have great power because they are the ones who allow trials to proceed or not. But they need to understand that, the structure of the trials and what is happening in the trial is frequently being done with an eye towards appealing to, regulators, clinicians, and payers, as opposed to having patients be like, wow, that was a great trial, and I really, I'm convinced this thing works, because that's not the end game. So here, let's get into some more controversial stuff. The benefit of participating in a trial is not access to an investigational drug. I realize many participants feel that's the primary benefit. It's not. The benefit of the trial is primarily societal, as I was talking about, in terms of we're advancing the field. And yes, there are individual benefits. We want patients to benefit from being in the trial, but those individual benefits are: you have increased interactions with the clinical team. That means, that it's like, oh, I feel different today, or I have a fever, or I have a concern. You have a direct contact to be able to have that conversation instead of having to wait, to whatever your normal clinical schedule is. That's a benefit. And then there's the possibility of medical benefit from this investigational drug, which I think is probably paramount to many patients. And I understand that. But, it is just one of the benefits that patients should be getting from clinical trials: this possibility of benefit, the definite increased interactions with the clinical team, and then, of course, the knowledge that they're actively involved in trying to change things for the patient population as a whole. That's altruism, and it's a huge motivator in clinical trials. And, I just applaud people who are really motivated on behalf of that. I participate in clinical research myself, just because I think if I'm doing this, work, I should really be able to walk the talk. And in many cases, I'm not doing things that I expect to medically benefit me. I'm doing things, with the idea that I will learn from the experience, but that hopefully I can help others. And, for me, that really is like a super warm, fuzzy glow. And I am sure many of you on this call have also experienced that. And, all kudos to you. Now, placebos. Placebos are deeply controversial, and I understand that. And that's because this idea that, I'm participating in this trial because I want to get the investigational drug. So why would I want to be in this trial and not get the investigational drug? So that's why I'm saying the benefit of participating in the trial is not access to the investigational drug. And keep in mind that placebo-controlled trials ethically cannot happen. And it's not just ethically. I mean, this is actually like enshrined in our whole oversight of trials. We can't run a trial if we know A is better than B. You can't randomize people to A or B if you know upfront which one is better. Now, you can have a deep-seated gut instinct. You can say, well, I'm really sure A is better, but there needs to be enough doubt among the community that it's still an open scientific question. Otherwise, if you're trying to run a placebo-controlled trial where we already know the active drug is superior to placebo, that just can't happen. And that's why we have data safety monitoring boards who look at the trials in real time. They are unblinded, they can see the actual data. And as soon as you get to that point where you can say, we can make a determination that A or B is either more effective than the other or less safe than the other, that it's time to stop the trial. And I want to note again, I think a lot of people who say, look, I understand it's a placebo-controlled trial. I may get a placebo and I'm okay with that because after, my X couple of months or weeks or what have you in the trial, I'm going to get access to the investigational drug, which is what I really want post-trial, through post-trial access, whether that's an open label extension or expanded access or whatnot. And I just, I made this point earlier, I want to beat it again, that that is a provisional arrangement. So if the drug is deemed beneficial, that is what's going to happen. But if the drug is not deemed beneficial, or if it's deemed inconclusive, there is no legal requirement to say, well, we're still going to give you this post-trial access. Post-trial access is legally required in some areas of the world. It is not required legally in the United States. So, research endeavors. Research is intended primarily for data collection. Individual benefit would be great if patients benefit from participating in a clinical trial. I think everybody's happy, but it's not guaranteed, and nor is it the primary objective. Now, remember, as said earlier, these research endeavors, these clinical trials, these open label extensions, et cetera, they cannot happen without patients. So it is really imperative for industry members to be thinking to themselves, what can I do to make this better for patients? But at the same time, it needs to be clear upfront, we're not doing this with the primary sole objective to benefit you, because that's just not what happens in a clinical trial. And in fact, we have seen situations, particularly in the neurological space, where if you look at the patients who were randomized to an active arm versus randomized to a placebo arm, the placebo patients are the ones who look better at the end. So it's just very important to have people not go into trials thinking access to this therapeutic, investigational therapeutic is what I'm doing this for, and it's going to help me, because that is far too simplistic. One thing in terms of when I say industry really needs to take it upon themselves to make the trials more humane and attractive to patients, I would really caution you that when it comes to either, trying to get rid of placebos or to do something other than a one-to-one randomization where for every patient who's put in a placebo arm, one goes into the active arm, I think those sound really appealing. And the question is, do they get us to our long-term goal, which is to have, we're not looking for access to anything. We're looking for access to something that is effective. So, it's sort of a question of, if you start doing things like, well, we're going to have a 1-to-2 or a 1-to-3 randomization, that may sound good up front, but the question is, does it delay the time point at which this product, if it is safe and effective, will actually be available to a larger number of patients? There's no absolute one-size-fits-all answer to this, but it is something that I see as a concern that really is not discussed as much as it could. And, again, I just want to point, Kathy mentioned a couple of years ago when I first came into ALS, I did not know ALS very well. I came from oncology, I came from pediatric rare disease. And one thing that I said frequently, and I'm sure Kathy heard me say this, is, I'm not even sure why we have placebos. ALS is a fatal disease. We know it's going to be a fatal disease. Why don't we just, randomize to natural history? And if the person doesn't die or doesn't die within a certain time period, then that's our effect size right there. We know that that's something different from what would have happened otherwise. And I have been schooled repeatedly by researchers in this field that, given the sort of heterogeneous nature of ALS, you cannot use natural history data as as a control, and especially given the fact that there's this ongoing evolution of other treatments, in terms of self-medication or dietary modifications or what have you. So your natural history data from even 5 years ago may not actually be representative of what's happening in the background of the patient population now. So happy to talk about all of that during Q&A. Okay, so I talked a minute ago about research. I said, it's really important to realize research is not intended to provide patient benefit, although if it does, that's great. But let's point out, as we all know, that not all patients can participate in research. There are limited slots, there are limited locations, particularly with a disease like ALS, you may not be able to travel to that location if it's not in your, close proximity. Really in ALS, this idea of you may not fit enrollment criteria. I know many trials are looking for people who are, fairly early in the disease or haven't hit certain progressive stages yet. So there are certain people who are just screened out of these research studies. And then of course, these sort of geographic and financial barriers. So I always pick on Wyoming because, if you just look at the number of active trial sites in Wyoming for any disease, not just ALS, but any disease, cancer, you name it, it's a handful versus I live in Manhattan, there's thousands of trials for different types of diseases here. And that really impacts who has the, just the social wherewithal to be able to participate in trials. So I will not belabor that. We know that not all patients can participate in research. And that's where we get to these non-trial pre-approval access, expanded access, right to try, et cetera, which are intended to permit access to unapproved products that may be personally beneficial to patients with no approved or research options. Now, again, individual benefit is not guaranteed, but it is the primary objective. And I see a typo on this slide, so ignore that, please. Individual benefit is the primary objective of these programs. And data collection may occur, but again, this is not a research project that is trying to get that generalizable data. It's not funded the way that trials are funded. It's not subject to oversight the way that trials are overseen. Asking physicians to collect data in expanded access programs may actually be a disincentive for clinicians because they just don't normally get funding from the sponsor to do that. So you're asking them to do uncompensated labor, and not all data that we could collect from these is actually useful or actionable. And I'll come back to that. So this is an article that my colleagues and I published recently, and I just want to hit this for 1 second. So this was in Pediatric Hematology. So forget that, but just look at this. We have this question of, do you believe the patient or family benefited from this expanded access case that we are talking about? So we had 40 cases, and you can see that in 36 cases, the clinician said, yes, I think the patient or the family benefited. And then we followed up and said, what kind of benefit? And you can, we gave them a whole list and said, you can pick as many as you want, or you can write in your own answers. So out of the 36 who said there was benefit, 33 indicated that it was the family that benefited. They had this focus on hope. So not the patient, the family. 23 indicated that the patient themselves had psychological benefit. So not, physiological benefit, but, psychological, felt better, felt hopeful. 18 indicated that the patient had improvement in overall survival. 17 indicated improvement in quality of life. 6 noted clinical benefits to the patient, but not things that affected quality of life or overall survival. So this could be something like your tumor shrunk, but not in any way that affected your trajectory or your experience of the disease. 3 noted benefits to the family of the patient. I don't know what they were, they didn't explain. And 1 noted that they or their institution learned from the experience. So there are lots of ways that people can benefit from expanded access, not all of which are actually physiological benefit. And I think that's okay as long as people understand that. So terms that make no logical sense and add to patient, clinician, societal confusion. I beg of my industry listeners to ixnay the terms compassionate use trial and expanded access trial. This is saying intended for patient benefit, research. Intended for patient benefit, research. It's just a non sequitur. So I think what sponsors really need to decide when they're creating a program is the main objective of this program to conduct research, or is it to provide access? And then to use language to convey that clearly, to be transparent about this is our goal with this program. And because this is our goal with this program, it impacts how we're structuring it, in terms of how long it's going to run, who can participate, the conditions, etc. Happy to talk about that. So here is this.
Alison, we've hit the 4:45 mark. So
Kat, I have to do this one last slide, and then it's all yours.
Over a little, so
non-trial pre-approval access pathways, as I said earlier, are only for patients who are unable to join a clinical trial. And that's a challenging question. What does that mean? Does that mean that if I don't have a caretaker who can drive me in, every 2 weeks, I'm unable? Or is it really, I don't meet the inclusion criteria? So that's a question. What does that mean? If you can't join a trial, again, we have this expanded access, we have right to try. I'll just say briefly, expanded access, you can have it for single patients, you can have it for groups of similar patients. And those groups programs range in size from, 2 to something to thousands. And what I really wanted to, let me just skip through to here. What I really want to point out is here, look, these expanded access programs, the first one, the single patient, can happen at any point in development, before a trial starts, during a trial, after a trial, anytime. Same with this medium-sized group program, can happen before a trial starts, during a trial, after a trial, anytime. The one where you start having thousands of people get access, that's typically only after your phase 3 trial has ended, because you really need to have evidence of efficacy before you do that. But, and we'll skip right to try. Right to try is not a very used pathway. It has been used in a few cases, but I don't think it's really worth me spending time on it right now. The sponsor is the main gatekeeper. So these decisions about when is it going to happen and for whom is really a sponsor decision. They communicate about this with FDA, and they really should be communicating with this about their patient advocacy partners to help manage expectation and understanding. But it's really the sponsor who gets to call the shots. And just remember, with their focus on bringing things to market, they have to be able to make a business case for why they're doing it the way they did it. And the last thing I want to say is, so does this mean you may offer expanded access during a trial? Sure. But what you need to do is, when you have all patients coming to you to say, may I try your product? The sponsor needs to evaluate them and say, look, if you're eligible for our trial, however we define that, then your only option is to join the trial. You don't get to join the expanded access. Expanded access is only for those who cannot participate in the trial. If you're ineligible for the trial, maybe you can participate in the expanded access, and that really depends on the program criteria. So the important thing is you have to have this wall between the two. And one thing that's tricky for sponsors is if there's no firm wall, they say, my gosh, I can't offer expanded access because people will sort of fake it. They'll game the system and pretend that, they're not eligible for the trial to get over to the other side of the wall. And so, here's some examples of things that could be in this wall. They live a certain amount of distance away. They have this particular genetic marker. They have caretaker availability who can bring them in or track this data at home for patient-reported outcomes. They have certain respiration ability, ambulatory ability. Some of these are much easier to, sort of manipulate than others. And I think most sponsors, if it's something that's not easy to manipulate, say we're fairly comfortable offering a side-by-side expanded access program. As soon as that divider starts being something that they think clinicians could manipulate for their patients, they start getting squeamish. Not in all cases, but in some cases. And I think the last thing I have to say before I turn it over to Mary is just to say, in both cases, this is where we have an importance of informed consent. Because when you go into that clinical trial, it needs to be explained to the patient. You don't get to drop out and go over to expanded access. Now, maybe if you complete the trial, will allow you to go over to expanded access, or maybe we'll take you over to some sort of post-trial approval, post-trial access program, like an open label extension or what have you. But you don't get to just say, wow, even though I'm still eligible, I want to drop out and get expanded access. That's something that is normally not spelled out in consent forms, and it needs to be. And so, Mary, I'll leave it there. So how about we go to questions?
Great, thank you very much, Allison. And I have the pre-submitted questions here, and we'll try to do this like a lightning round. And for the ones that have already been covered, I'm skipping them so
Yep.
that we concentrate.
I think I got most of them, so just skip it.
How quickly after inquiry should a physician and person with ALS expect a response regarding expanded access from a sponsor?
There is no legal requirement. It depends on the company, but what that company does have to do by law is have publicly available, typically on their website, a statement of how long that's going to be. So you should never be in a case where you're sitting there going, I put in my request and I don't know when I'm going to hear, because they are required to put up front, you will hear within, 5 business days or whatever it is.
Thank you. Do people have to keep inquiring to see if expanded access is opened up for their situations? It seems like an inefficient process.
It's a super inefficient process. The whole thing of trying to find expanded access is an inefficient process. There was an initiative a couple of years ago to come up with something called the Expanded Access Navigator, which was meant to be a one-stop shop. It is voluntary for companies to participate in it, and many companies chose not to. So if your company chose not to participate in the Expanded Access Navigator, I would suggest that you consider doing that. There was also a effort to try to get expanded access listed in clinicaltrials.gov, which is where many patients and doctors know to go to look for trials. But again, that has not been incredibly consistent. It would be really wonderful for patient advocacy groups to be able to fill that void and say, we're going to track who has open expanded access programs and proactively blast that out to our communities, instead of having it be on the individual patient or caretaker's shoulders to keep checking, okay, sponsor A, sponsor B, sponsor C, etc.
Thank you very much. It is an inefficient process. And we had kind of a related question that I'm going to try to jump on. Somebody asked what is currently available for ALS patients through expanded access. We found, of course, the brainstorm expanded access for people who had been in the trial. There's the clean expanded access that is available. And we know that expanded access is coming for other platform trial products. And also we know that there are probably a lot of one-offs, but in terms of if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, the only ones you find are the clean and the brainstorm. What are the considerations around serious adverse events that could occur during an EAP program that could pose a risk to overall clinical trial?
So this is something that the biopharmaceutical industry has been deeply concerned about. We designed our trial for this certain type of patient population, and now we're saying, well, maybe we should give our unproven drug to somebody outside of that. And who knows what could happen? They could have a really bad consequence, and that would have impact on our entire trial, not to mention our entire development of this drug, even for potential other indications. That really is quite the bugaboo that pharmacy has been worried about. 3 years ago, I think, FDA actually put out a statement. It's on their website that says, please don't be so worried about this. We understand that sometimes people have, either drug-related adverse events, but they're constrained. It was something strange about that circumstance, or sometimes things happen to patients and it had nothing to do with the drug. They just happened to have this other thing happen at the same time. And it's our job to be able to evaluate this and parse out causality. And so don't worry that this is necessarily going to kill your trial if something bad happens in expanded access. I don't know how persuaded industry as a whole has been by that, but that certainly has been the message for about the last 3 years now from FDA.
Thank you. We had a bunch of questions that were kind of had a similar theme about the best way for advocates to enable expanded access. I'll read this one specifically. What do you feel is the best way for the community, people with ALS, caregivers, industry, healthcare professionals, ethicists, and advocacy groups to work together to create a best practice or guidelines for expanded access program so that they meet the community's expectations and needs, but also to balance the needs for robust ethical clinical trials? And also we have another one here. How should companies and patient groups collaborate on this in general?
So I think companies and patient groups should be collaborating like literally from, phase 1 on, in terms of just, creating those networks and being transparent about, this is a research project we are proposing. This is a access program we are proposing. This is, the size that we're thinking. This is, why we think this should be placebo controlled. This is why we're only doing this in the United States, not globally. I think all of those conversations should happen with advocacy and should happen proactively in order to identify where, tensions are going to arise, and also just to, really get the end users feedback on what's going to work, what's not, and what could be done better. I put up this slide just to point out the stuff at the bottom, which I think really goes to your other question, Kathy, in terms of, what do we really need to push this area forward? I think all companies need to be working with patient or patient advocates, and that's a contentious issue. So who is a bona fide voice? Every patient is different, and a newly diagnosed patient who is just scrambling to learn things versus someone who's been in the trenches for years, those are different. So I think it would be really good to have community guidelines about who is this patient voice that you're working with? How? Why? Do they get paid? Are they treated as key opinion leaders, or are they just sort of seen as discretionary fluff, which I would urge companies not to do? I think that companies really should be having these conversations with their competitors. The question is, I don't want to diminish other people's trial potential population, because trials is really what is going to end up bringing transformative therapies to people. So when I'm planning my expanded access program, can I have, not anything proprietary, but just sort of top-level conversations with other industry members about, what's going to be happening in the next 12 months? Is there anything I need to be worried about in impairing their ability to enroll by doing what I'm thinking about doing? Having these conversations with clinicians and institutions. Clinicians are so confused about how to do this, and they're the one who's supposed to be doing it on behalf of patients. So really, educating clinicians. And one of the things I really want to point out is institutions. There are institutions who, when you go to them and say, there's one patient here, we want to treat them through expanded access. This is not research. It is, intended to benefit this one patient, although that's not guaranteed. The institution will say, great, but before that drug can be brought onto the property, they require the drug company to fill out an entire, ream of paperwork like they would if they were setting up a clinical trial. That's not appropriate. And I would just refer industry to Pfizer. Pfizer has figured out how to do this in a 5-page document that takes like a day. And that's really, when you're talking about seriously ill people with, limited time, that's the sort of thing that we don't have time to do. 21st century cures transparency requirements. That's what I was saying about companies are supposed to have publicly available, do we provide expanded access? How do you request it? How long is it going to take to get an answer? How is the determination made, et cetera? If that information is not publicly available from a company, I would urge patient advocacy groups to contact that company and say, we see you're not in compliance. What is it you're going to do to get in compliance as quickly as possible? Ending provision. These programs all end, and it's always a delicate balance of trying to figure out, who can transfer to commercial product. Well, wait a minute, it's ending because it wasn't effective. So what do we do then? I think just being, situational about what are the issues that are coming up, and let's have that open and engaged dialogue now would be really useful.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to take advantage.
Sorry, Kathy, I guess the last thing is companies frequently are concerned about the fact, well, I can only offer a small expanded access program. We just don't have the money to do it. But if I, only do a 30-person expanded access program, am I not going to just get grief from the community, the patient community, the clinician community, that I didn't do something larger? And I think that's another area where it'd be really good to be having these discussions with patient advocacy. I can't tell a company, yeah, you should do this, or no, you shouldn't do this. I think you need to have a discussion with people in that therapeutic area who can say, wow, a 30-person program, that really would be valuable. And yeah, we understand you're going to have to make tough decisions about who those 30 people are, but we can work with you and figure that out. Or can say alternatively, we don't think 30 people is worth it. So I think that is a really wonderful situation where industry and patient advocacy could work together.
And that's the perfect segue into the next question. That is, I'm interested in learning about fair and equitable distribution of a drug when demand for access greatly exceeds supply.
I mean, there are all different ways to do it, and there's no one size fits all. So you could say first come, first serve. Whoever gets their request in first is going to get it until we run out. Ethicists don't like that simply because it sort of privileges those people who are already privileged in society. They get sort of a boost forward. You could have a lottery. There's a expanded access program globally right now for a gene therapy called Zolgensma that is a global lottery. Free provision of drug to people anywhere in the world who are able to get pulled out of this lottery. People in the United States and Europe tend to not like that because they just think it feels uncomfortable. People in Asia and South America and who frequently have multi-year lags before drugs come to them were ecstatic about this because it actually put them on the same playing field as other people. So there are often pros and cons of various sorts. And then I think one of the things that people really paid quite attention to is I did a project with Johnson & Johnson along with some colleagues where we set up an independent committee, and the independent committee was the one who decided, okay, we only have 5 doses of drug this week. We have 15 requests, who gets it? And that really, takes the responsibility off the drug company and puts it onto a, blinded sort of, controlled third party who makes that decision. So there are lots of different options.
Thank you very much. Are you okay to keep going?
I'm okay to keep going.
Time-wise?
That we're running over though.
Thank you. We'll keep going. I have one more of the pre-submitted questions, and then we'll go to the online questions. The last pre-submitted question: my doctor told me there is so much paperwork involved to submit a request for expanded access. How many forms are involved, and how much time approximately do you think it takes to complete the paperwork?
So there are 2 different types of paperwork. One is the paperwork that you're back up. Let me see. Here, remember I said there are 2 different types of expanded access. There's single patient INDs, the single patient expanded access, and then these groups. The group expanded access program really looks like a clinical trial. So it's going to have the same amount of paperwork as any clinical trial. I think what this question is probably talking about is the single patient expanded access program. There has been a myth floating around that it took this massive amount of paperwork to do single patient expanded access. That was never true, but it's definitely not true now because people have sort of rejiggered the paperwork to make it more clear about what you do and do not have to fill out. It's a 2-page form. It's front and back. It's 45 minutes. That's the government's estimate, is that it's 45 minutes. So in my opinion, it's actually shorter than that. That is submitted to the FDA. Now, the drug company itself may have a form. Frequently, companies have these sort of online portals at this point. So it'll require some time on behalf of someone from the clinic, a doctor or a nurse or somebody to fill that out. I have no ballpark on how long that part takes, but I also haven't heard people complaining about it. I honestly think what the bigger concern in the paperwork is what I was saying about these institutional agreements with the sponsor. So if you say, look, we have this one patient, it's really urgent, we get drug to them, and then the institution says, okay, we'll go fill out these 400 pages of paperwork. Obviously that's not going to fly, and that's not the doctor who does that, that's the sponsor. So I think one thing that would be useful is for patient advocacy groups who hear about these concerns to contact the various sponsors in the area and say, look, are you being able to successfully navigate expanded access with institutions, or are they really acting like it's a clinical trial? And if so, what can we do to resolve this? I will say that the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA, which is a non-governmental entity that advises the FDA, was trying to pull some guidance about this together a couple years ago. I'm not sure that ever saw the light of day, and I do think that that's something that would be very useful.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to turn things over now to Lisa. Lisa, do you want to give us the Q&A that came in online, please?
Yeah, so I think some of them were answered, and I'm trying to sift through and make sure that the ones that weren't we can address. Just a couple of comments. 21st Century Cures applies to phase 2 and phase 3 studies. That was a comment from pharma company, and
That's
also a comment that
Yep, that's true.
and a comment that Neurosense Therapeutics also has an expanded access for their NST-002 study. So, okay, I'll start with the first question. So adverse events in expanded access programs were super low, like 0.2% versus just under 8% in trials. So of the 11,000 EAPs, there hasn't been one that has affected a trial outcome. Can you clarify this?
Yeah, I don't really know, whoever wrote that, if you're talking about numbers that or government reported numbers. I asked FDA a couple years ago. I said, I can see a couple things that happen once you get a serious adverse event report from expanded access. One is you put a clinical hold on the trial and say, this trial can't enroll new patients, et cetera, until we figure out what happened. And obviously that may not be ideal. So clinical holds. And the other thing that I could really think of is when the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, whatever it is, trials are done and the company submits to the FDA for approval, would the advisory board or someone at FDA go back through the paperwork and come up and say, well, I saw this serious adverse event and expanded access and I'm worried about that. Maybe, imagine, it was someone who had compromised renal function, which is why they weren't in the trial in the first place. And they got the drug outside of the trial and something bad happened. Would FDA at that late point say something like, we think we need a trial in people with kidney disease in order to really, put a nail into this and know whether it's something we need to worry about or not. So I asked FDA to go back and look at that. So they analyzed, I think, 10 years of data. They published this. We can share the citation afterwards if people are interested, and basically said that based on serious adverse events in expanded access, they had done I think it was like 2 clinical holds in 10 years and never a situation of where they were, making their final determination, sort of resurfaced it to say we need more data. 2 clinical holds in 10 years is super inconsequential from my point of view, but that really depends on the time, the length of the clinical hold, because, the time is money and time is patient lives, et cetera. And in both cases, they were very short clinical holds. I think in one case, it turned out that the patient had been given the wrong dose of a drug. So that was resolved very quickly. I don't remember what happened in the other one. So I think that data putting out from the FDA was one of the things that sort of buttressed FDA's stance, saying, don't worry too much about the serious adverse events. We're going to look into it. We have to look into it to see what happened. But, we're pretty smart and able to figure out what happens. And, unless it was directly related to use of the drug the way it was meant to be used, you don't really have too much to worry about. But that being said, going back to my, opening comment, this is a business, right? And businesses try to reduce risk. And you can totally see why a business says, this is a discretionary risk and I'm not willing to take it. And, it is the company's decision whether it's going to do expanded access and for whom. And so other than just saying, I think they need to be transparent about that and hear, opinions from other members of the community who may say, we don't think that your stance is appropriate, that it is the sponsor's prerogative to decide whether it's going to do expanded access or not. And if it finds the idea of consequences of serious adverse events too scary, well, that's what it is.
Okay, next we have from Anonymous. Seems to me that from the patient's general attitude towards clinical trials is negative. How can we as an advocacy group help to create a more positive attitude towards enrolling? We recognize barriers do exist, but in your opinion, how can we go about breaking down those barriers?
So I'll just say, I did another panel earlier today, and there was a patient and someone who works in patient advocacy, has multiple hats, but this patient said, as a patient, I am very interested in access, but I'm interested in access to things that are effective. I'm not interested in access to things just to sort of have a pat on the head and be told, you know, here you can have the access you want. That is a opinion of one person who I'm citing to you here that some people in the patient community share. There are other people who say, you know, look, I have limited time and access is 100% important to me. You know, I have to go for it because this is my only opportunity. And I understand it may not work, but I need to try. And I don't think either of those positions are wrong, but they are different and they have different consequences for policies. So I think it would be really helpful for the community to have an open dialogue about that and say, you know, are we pushing for access's sake, or are we pushing for access, but, you know, with really prioritizing trying to have that be, you know, post-approval access of something we know is safe and effective, and then try to get it out to as many people as possible. It's a really complicated and painful conversation to have, but I would suggest that people do it. The only other thing I want to say is, you know, I really do think that there's many ways that trials can be made more appealing to patients, and it would, you know, those conversations are already happening, but the conversations about, you know, compensation, where is the trial cited? How long is the trial going on for? Who has input into what, you know, sort of the logistics of the trial are? All of those things are things that, you know, I really encourage open and active dialogue on, with the hope that we're going to end up making trials more appealing to people.
Okay, next would be if patients in the RCT, I'm guessing that's real use clinical trial?
Randomized clinical trial.
Oh, okay, randomized clinical trial still on the placebo in a study close to enrollment. Should people who have qualified in the study be allowed to participate in the EAP program?
Say it one more time.
If patients in the RCT are still on placebo in a study closed to enrollment, should people who have qualified to be in the study be allowed into the EAP program?
So most of the time when you have a placebo-controlled randomized trial, it's double-blinded. That patient does not know if they're on placebo, their clinician does not know if they're on placebo, et cetera. So it wouldn't be the situation of you're like, okay, the trial closed, we have 5 people who are on placebo and we're going to cross them over to expanded access, because you don't know that they're on placebo. So you need to wait until the trial actually finishes, then people are unblinded, et cetera. And then at that point, you should be able to say to people who are in the trial, look, you were randomized to the active arm, or you were randomized to the placebo arm. Here is our post-trial access provision. Do you want it or not?
Okay. Do you think passing?
Alison, I'm going to butt in on that. May I butt in on that one for a second? Because I think that one was directly to the Biogen situation. And I'd like to ask, because it seems to me that the issue could have been dealt with, that once that trial closed to new enrollment, could they not have supplied expanded access to people who could not get into the trial because it was closed to new enrollment, who might have wanted access to the therapy?
So I don't want to talk about the Biogen case specifically. On my disclosures, I said that I do advise Biogen. I will speak in generalities and say, when a trial closes to enrollment, can you, before the readout, start an expanded access program? Is that a fair enough question?
That is my question. Exactly.
So if you look at this top,
can you start an expanded program or continue an expanded access program?
So you broke up for a second. I'm just going to keep going, and you can tell me in a second if I missed something. Oh. So if you look at this slide on the sort of first 3 lines, non-trial pre-approval access via expanded access or right to try, et cetera, is not legally required. It's at the company's discretion, which also means when the company starts it is at the company's discretion. Does that mean that, advocates can't push back and say, you're starting this too late, or we don't like how you're starting it? Sure, you can do that. It's a complex ecosystem, but there is no legal requirement to provide expanded access at all. Now, post-trial access, as I said earlier, not so much in the United States, but globally is sometimes legally required. So they say if you're in the trial and if you appear to be benefiting, whether it's being randomized to the placebo or to the active arm, if you benefited during the trial, you have to be given something post-trial. If that's the case and if that's the law, then you actually do have to do that. That's different from expanded access, though. That's one of these open label extensions or some other thing. And I put here that that's often ethically required as well, simply because we expect there to be some sort of reciprocity back to people. You participated in our trial, you helped us out. We are now going to help you out as well. But this is really limited to if there was a beneficial effect. If the person was randomized to the active arm and didn't seem to be having any sort of benefit, there's no requirement to continue giving it. And if the person was randomized to the placebo arm, we don't know if there's a benefit or not. So you would be ethically, it would be suggested that you go ahead and give them access for at least a period of time to look and see if there was a benefit or not. Moving back from post-trial access for a second to this expanded access question. So expanded access is not ethically required until there's proof of efficacy. So if you look at many companies and say, when do you start doing expanded access? Many companies don't do it pre-phase 2, because phase 2 is the phase of drug development in which we start having some sort of evidence to support that this thing might be effective. Now, of course, that's not completely determinative. You could then have a phase 3 trial that doesn't pan out, but at least there's that initial feeling of this product is effective. You don't have any obligation to provide something to people that is not effective. And then I put here, but the moral compulsion grows to offer it once there's capability. So do you have supply? Do you have money? Do you have personnel? Do you have the things that you need in order to be able to provide this to people? If you don't and you can't, then that's just what it is. But if you could say, yeah, we budgeted for this, we planned for it, we can do this, we have supply, then, it may be that you have more of a moral compulsion to actually do it. Need, you normally don't see people saying that there's a moral compulsion to provide expanded access to something that's like the 12th iteration of the same drug, like a Me Too drug or something for like, acne. Like it's really a question of, is this a life-threatening serious disease? And if so, if there's this capability to provide access and then there's this serious need, that starts pushing you more towards the end where you might say, well, it might be ethically, important to do this in this situation. And then that's really where this third tier comes in of, do we have evidence of safety and efficacy? Now, a company is free to say, I don't care. I don't care about efficacy. I'm going to give it to people from phase 1. That's fine. Phase 1 expanded access allows that, but it certainly does not require that. And most companies really sort of say, if I could do expanded access at any point in time, I really want to do it after I have evidence of efficacy. And the other thing I want to say there is, it's not only the company involved in this, the FDA is involved in this, that doctor, the treating physician is involved in this, and an IRB, an institutional review board, is also involved in reviewing these requests for non-trial pre-approval access. And all of them are looking to say, does this, for this particular patient, does this seem to offer more risk, more chance of benefit versus risk of harm? And it'd be very hard for somebody to make that that determination if you don't have any evidence of efficacy. It's not impossible, but it's hard.
Okay.
Kathy, did that help?
That helps. That helps. I just thought that was a moment when we needed to kind of probe a little. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, and I put here, so most compelling cases, you have a drug that's cheap to manufacture and use. It's not like one of these, you know, we need to have surgery and, you know, put this into your spinal cord, et cetera, something that's cheap to manufacture and use. It's available. We have enough supply because we planned ahead of time to make sure we had extra supply. It's a life-threatening disease, and we've had a positive phase 3 readout. That's the most compelling case that I can possibly think of to look at a company square in the eye and say, you really need to do this, because we know it helps people who have no other option. And we know they can't get access to it for X period of time until it is approved and actually commercially available. And you have a moral obligation to help people. And that's where we get to, this is the slide again, where we have the treatment use, where I said thousands of patients. You know, it was a positive phase 3 trial. It's a serious need. And we say to the company, you know, you don't really have any excuses at this point in time because you have the product available. We know it helps people and we know there's need. Just go ahead and start making it available now.
Okay.
Thank you, Lisa. We've gone way over. Lisa, can you help maybe pick off a couple of quick ones?
Oh, okay. What's your opinion of the proposed Act for ALS legislation?
I'm gonna defer and not answer that one.
Okay. There's another.
Did you see the law student question?
Which one?
The law student question.
I think let me go back and say the reason why I'm not answering that is because I saw a version of the bill last legislative session. I haven't seen the new version, and what I saw previously, there were some things I liked, there were some things I didn't like, and I don't feel comfortable opining on it now since I haven't seen the more recent version.
Okay. I think everything's been covered. Do you see any holes here?
There's this one that I thought it was an interesting question. Do you think passing legislation requiring open label extension for placebo participants post-trial would help or hinder the goal of wide access to the best treatments for most people?
Well, I'm sure that's a more complicated question than I can think through at the moment. But I'll change it into, you know, in some areas of the world, there is this requirement for post-trial access if a patient had a beneficial experience during the trial. And of course, that means if you were on placebo, you know, you get the chance to have that beneficial experience. I'm in favor of that legislation. I think requiring post-trial access is, when there's benefit, is the right thing to do to show reciprocity to those patients. Because remember, the trials can't happen without the patients. But, you know, sometimes things are different in the United States than they are in other countries. So I would want to think more broad spectrum about that before I really committed to an answer.
Okay, here.
And we've gone way over. Anything?
Well, this one will be a quick one. How long after the trial ends are patients told if they were in the placebo or the treatment arm?
It should be very quick. And the reason it should be very quick is because the patient needs to have that information to plan what comes next for them. So if there is an open label extension, or if there's an expanded access program or what have you, that patient needs to know what arm of the trial they were on to be able to say, you know, I didn't like the side effects. I didn't really feel it was helpful. I don't think I'm going to do this, versus I was on the placebo. You know, I thought I felt, you know, this really bad side effect, but I guess that was something different. So yeah, maybe I'll give it a try now that I know that wasn't an actual ramification of the investigational drug. That was something different because I was on placebo. So I think it should be very soon. Now the question is, what is very soon? Is it days or is it weeks? I think that's really for someone more embedded in industry to answer than for me, but I would just advocate for it to be very soon.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Lisa, thank you. Michael, thanks so much for running the control panel here. Alison, I really appreciate it.
Let me pull up my email address, because I was going to tell people that if they wanted to, you're welcome to email me at this email address. I can try to answer questions. I guess if there's a deluge, it might take a while to get through them. I'm also on Twitter. I don't answer questions like this on Twitter simply because they're normally nuanced conversations, and Twitter's not the place for that. but I am here and try to post about, you know, policy and law dealing with expanded access. So feel free to reach out to me. And the one question I didn't get to talk about at all, and I apologize, is real world evidence from expanded access. So maybe we can do a separate session on that someday.
Thank you. We hope we can ask you back for another session. This has been a wonderful gift that you've given us. Thank you for all of your expertise and time. Thanks everybody who made this happen. And that's a wrap.
Bye, everyone.